The needle went through my lower lip like it had been practicing on me for years. Not a clean slide. Not mercy. Not the quick mercy of steel. But a slow insistence push, pinch, pull until my flesh finally surrendered and the thread followed. Thick cotton that tasted like dust and old sacks and the back of a pantry where rats had learned to prey. My wrists were strapped to the table so tight the leather bit down to bone, and every time I tried to flinch, the straps answered for them. The basement air was damp and sour, a place where mildew lived happily and sound died without witnesses. Dr. Whitfield stood over me with his hands trembling, his eyes refusing mine, his bag open like a mouth that didn't belong to him. To my left, Mistress Beatrice Harlow watched as if she were attending a recital, her gloved fingers folded, her posture perfect, her face lit by the small lantern that made every shadow look like a confession. "Tighter," she said, and her voice did not rise or shake. It didn't have to. She had built her authority out of calm. If she can whisper, she can poison the house with that tongue of hers. I want it sealed. I want her to learn silence the way you learn hunger. Dr. Whitfield swallowed. He had the pale skin of men who lived indoors and the thin, careful movements of men who had trained their hands to look gentle while doing what they were told. I saw his guilt-like sweat on his forehead, but I also saw something else beneath it, the fear of losing comfort. Fear always speaks softer than cruelty, but it's the one that gets obeyed. "Mistress Harlow," he began, as if the title could protect him. "The risk of infection. Then she die," Beatrice replied, as lightly as if she were discussing a spoiled cut of meat. "And I will purchase another. You'll sew a mouth today, or you'll explain to my husband why I no longer require your visits." I learned early on that Master Richard Harlow did not rule this plantation. He hid behind paper and bourbon in his study like a child hiding under blankets from thunder, leaving Beatrice to invent weather. She invented it daily. She invented storms out of cracked teacups, hurricanes out of a misplaced ribbon, lightning out of a look she didn't like on a slave's face. She had made a religion out of correction. Her daughter Margaret and son James, 16 and 14, watched her like apprentices watch a master artisan. They learned when to laugh. They learned when to look away. They learned that there is a kind of cruelty that is admired when you dress it in manners. I lay on that table and stared at Beatrice's mouth, at her lips pink and soft and free-moving as she directed the theft of mine. If she had screamed, if she had raged, it would have been simpler. But she didn't need to scream. She had the whole house trained, the whole plantation trained, even Dr. Whitfield trained. That was her talent. She could turn people into tools without ever raising her voice. The needle entered again, higher this time, catching a nerve that sent heat across my face like a whip made of fire. I tried to shout, but pain swallowed the sound before it could be born. "Hold her," Whitfield murmured to the two men he'd brought down with him, slaves with eyes fixed on the floor, hands obeying, because hands can't afford conscience in a world that punishes it. Their palms pressed my shoulders, not to hurt me, but to keep me alive through the hurting. I tasted blood, metallic and warm, filling the small space that was about to be taken from me forever. I wanted to spit it out. I couldn't. I wanted to tell Beatrice that she was already empty, that no amount of suffering would fill her. I had told her that once upstairs, in the parlor, and this was what truth brought you in a house like hers. 3 days earlier, the morning had started like every morning in my 8 years at Harlow. I rose before dawn, lit the kitchen fire, mixed cornmeal, stirred, served. I had learned the plantation's rhythms, the way you learn the sound of an approaching snake, not by studying it, but by surviving it. Every surface in that house had to shine, because Beatrice believed shine was virtue. She believed dust was rebellion. She believed silence was obedience. She moved through her home if it were a stage built for her alone. And we, those of us with brown skin and no surnames, were the furniture that talked too much in her imagination. That morning, little Emma dropped a plate, just a slip of a small hand, porcelain meeting wood with a crack that wasn't loud enough to wake the dead, but loud enough to offend Beatrice's pride. Emma was 6, thin as a reed, eyes too big because hunger makes eyes bigger. She started to cry the second it happened, not because she was hurt, but because she knew what sound a broken plate made in Beatrice's heart. Beatrice slapped her so hard, the child's head snapped sideways, and when Emma fell, she did not fall like a child falls. She fell like a thing thrown. Blood ran from her nose onto the clean kitchen floor, making a red stain that would take me an hour to scrub out. Beatrice stood over her as if the child were a bug she'd stepped on by accident. "Clumsy animal," she said. "No food today. Maybe hunger will teach you how to hold what belongs to me." I remember the way the word belong sounded when she said it. Like a hymn, like a law. Something in me broke then, not into pieces, but into a single sharp edge. I stepped between Beatrice and Emma. My hands shook, but my voice didn't. "She's a baby," I said. "She made a mistake. That doesn't give you the right to beat her like she's nothing." Silence fell over the kitchen. Even the fire seemed to pause. Beatrice's eyes widened, not with surprise that a slave spoke, but with insult that the air itself had allowed it. She leaned forward slightly, as if to hear better, as if the audacity required close inspection. "What did you say?" she asked softly. That softness was the dangerous part. "I said you're cruel," I told her. The words came out like they'd been waiting in my throat for years. "And you do it because you're unhappy. You do it because you're empty inside, and you can't stand it." I should have stopped. I knew I should have stopped. I'd lived under her long enough to know the punishment for speaking truth in her house. But there are moments when the body decides it would rather die honest than live careful. "You think hurting people makes you powerful," I continued, and now my voice was steady in a way that shocked even me. "But it only shows how small you are. You have everything, and still you're rotten." Her face changed. The polite mask slipped as if it had been cut loose. For a moment I saw what lived underneath, a fury that wasn't just anger, but humiliation, the kind that demands blood to erase it. "You forget what you are," she whispered. "You forget who owns you." "I know what I am," I said. "I'm a human being. The kitchen wasn't mine. Emma wasn't mine. My own body wasn't mine in the eyes of the law. But in that moment my words were mine." Beatrice turned her head as if calling a servant, though none of us moved without being commanded. "Fetch Dr. Whitfield," she ordered. "Now." Then she looked back at me and smiled like someone who had just found a new toy. "You want to speak," she said. "I will teach you what your mouth is for." She didn't hit me then. That would have been too ordinary. Beatrice hated ordinary punishments. Ordinary punishments ended too quickly. She liked punishments that left a mark you carried into the next day, the next year, the rest of your life. In the hours that followed, she kept me working like nothing had happened. That was her first mind game. She made you hope she'd forgotten. Hope is a leash. By evening, when the house was quiet and Master Richard had retreated to his study and the children had gone upstairs, she came for me with 2 men and a lantern. "Come," she said, and she didn't have to shout. I followed because I knew the alternative was worse for someone else. That was another trick she liked, making you choose your own suffering to keep it off a weaker neck. They took me down the basement steps, each creak of wood sounding like a warning. The basement was where Beatrice kept the parts of herself she couldn't show at tea. Old stains on stone, a wooden table worn smooth by bodies, hooks on the wall for tools that shouldn't have been in a home. When Dr. Whitfield arrived, he looked at the table and the straps and the needle he pulled from his bag, and for a second I saw panic in his eyes. It vanished quickly. He looked at Beatrice and his panic became obedience. "Do it," she told him. "She's been talking back. I'm tired of hearing it." He tried again, weakly. "Mistress, this is not a medical procedure." "No," she said, stepping closer. "It's a lesson, and you will teach it." That was the moment I understood what Beatrice was really doing. She wasn't only punishing me, she was punishing the idea that I had a mind. She was making a spectacle of my silence, so every slave on that plantation would swallow their thoughts before they reached their tongues. She wanted the house to breathe in one rhythm, hers. Back in the basement now, with the needle going in and out of my lips, I refused to give her what she wanted most, the sight of me begging. I stared at her instead. I memorized her. The faint freckle near her left nostril, the way she held her chin slightly high, like the world smiled beneath her, the small twitch at the corner of her mouth when pain pleased her. I made a promise to myself that did not require words. Dr. Whitfield pulled the thread tight, and my lips drew together like a wound being forced shut before it could heal. The pain was bright and immediate. I felt saliva pool and blood mix with it, felt my breath shorten, because panic always comes when the body realizes it has been altered. Whitfield's voice was hoarse. "Hold still," he whispered, not to help me, but to help himself survive what he was doing. He tied off the final stitch and sat back as if he'd run a mile. "It's done," he said. Beatrice leaned in close to inspect his work. Her perfume drifted over me, sweet and suffocating, a scent that belonged to parties and lies. She traced a gloved fingertip along the line of stitches, not touching, just hovering, like she wanted my pain without the mess. "Perfect," she said. Then she straightened and spoke louder, so the men holding me could hear, so the walls could hear, so the house above us could hear through the floorboards if it dared. "Let this be a reminder," she said, "that a slave's voice is a privilege granted, not a right possessed." The men unstrapped me, and I nearly fell because my legs had gone numb with terror and restraint. They hauled me up like a sack and carried me to the small room off the back hallway that Beatrice used when she wanted someone hidden. She didn't put me in the quarters with the others. She put me alone. Isolation was part of her lesson. If I couldn't speak, she would also make sure I couldn't be heard in any other way. The first night, I tried to drink water from a cup left on the floor. I tilted my head back and tried to let it run through the gaps between my teeth. Most of it spilled down my chin. My throat burned with thirst. My mouth throbbed and pulsed and tightened, and every swallow pulled at the stitches as if my own body was trying to tear itself free. The second night, fever came. I felt heat under my skin like coals. The stitches had been pulled too tight, cutting circulation, inviting infection the way an open door invites thieves. I could smell it already, the sour, sweet rot of flesh that doesn't get air. I pressed my hands to my swollen lips and felt the thread like tiny chains. I wanted to scream. I couldn't. I wanted to pray. I did, without sound. But prayer in that house felt like speaking into a coffin. On the third day, Dr. Whitfield came to check me. He didn't knock. He never knocked when he came to see property. He stood over me with a bottle of alcohol and a cloth. When he dabbed the wound, it burned so hard my vision went white. He flinched at my reaction, but his hands continued, "Steady now, because once you start doing evil, your hands eventually learn to do it well." He whispered, "I'm sorry," like that mattered. I looked straight at him and let him see that sorry was another kind of cowardice. He swallowed again, eyes glassy. "She have me ruined if I refuse," he murmured, as if that was the worst thing that could happen in this room. Before he left, he placed a slate and a stub of chalk on the table beside my bed. That was his first small act of rebellion, giving me a way to speak without speaking. Beatrice came later that day, and I knew she was coming before I saw her because the air changed when she entered a space, as if the room tightened around her like a corset. She carried a small plate of food cornbread and a bit of salt pork, and she held it where I could smell it. My stomach clenched with hunger. She smiled at that. Not a wide smile, just enough to show she noticed. "How is your silence, Mercy?" she asked, using my name like a joke. "Do you feel wiser, humble?" She set the plate on the table just out of reach. "Another mind game, another lesson. I want you to understand something," she said, leaning close enough that I could see the tiny veins in her eyes. "The worst pain isn't the needle. It's knowing you have thoughts and know where to put them. It's knowing you could speak and choosing not to because you're afraid. That's what I'm giving you. A cage you carry in your own face." She straightened and looked around the room as if judging my prison like decor. "You will live," she decided. "Not because you deserve it. Because I want time. I want you to sit with what you did, with what you said to me, with the knowledge that I can take pieces of you whenever I please." She moved toward the door, then paused and glanced back. "And Mercy," she added softly, If I hear even a whisper, if I see you try to make your eyes speak to the others, like you're telling a story, then I will sew your eyelids next." When she left, the room felt colder, not because the air changed, but because the truth settled in. She wasn't finished. She never finished. She would find new ways to make me small, and she would do it slowly, with patience, like a woman tending a garden of suffering. I lay back on the bed and felt my fever rise, felt the infection tighten its grip, and I realized a thing she didn't understand about cages. They can hold rage until it becomes sharp enough to cut through anything. I reached for the slate, my hands shaking, and scratched one word in chalk so hard the tip snapped: "Remember." The next morning my fever broke the way a branch breaks under a boot, sudden, loud inside my skull. Then quiet except for the ache that followed. Sweat soaked the thin mattress and my hair stuck to my neck. And when I tried to sit up, the room swayed as if the walls were drunk. The stitches had stiffened overnight, crusted with dried blood, and my lips felt like they belonged to someone else, swollen and numb at the edges, burning at the center where the thread soared each time I breathed. I reached for the cup and tried again, tilting it carefully, letting water slide between my teeth, but most of it ran down my chin and onto my chest, cold and wasted. Hunger lived in me like an animal now, clawing at my ribs, but thirst was worse, because thirst made every thought raw and urgent and made Beatrice's footsteps sound like salvation when they were only a warning. The slate lay beside me, the chalk stub dull and broken, and I kept looking at the word I'd scratched, "remember," like it was a door I could walk through. When the latch clicked, my whole body tensed before my mind could decide, and then Emma slipped into the room as quietly as a ghost, carrying a small cloth bundle pressed to her chest. Her eyes were wide, darting to the corners, to the crack under the door, to the window that didn't open. She looked older than 6 in that moment, like fear had stretched her childhood thin. She took 2 steps toward me and froze, as if she wasn't sure I was real. Then her face crumpled, and she made a sound that wasn't a sob, because she'd learned sobs traveled. She held out the bundle and I took it with shaking hands. Inside were damp rags, clean enough, and a piece of cornbread broken into small chunks. I wanted to touch her cheek, to tell her she hadn't done wrong, to tell her the plate didn't matter, that nothing in that kitchen mattered compared to the way Beatrice looked at us like we were stains. I lifted my hand, but Emma flinched, not from me, never from me, but from the idea of being seen in kindness. She whispered, "Miss Mercy, I'm sorry," and my throat tightened so hard it felt like another stitch. I shook my head and tapped the slate with my fingertip, then wrote slowly, each letter a fight against dizziness. "Not your fault." Emma leaned close to read. Her lips moved silently with the words and her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Crying was for safe houses, and this was not one. "She said you tried to curse her," Emma murmured. "She told Mr. Harlow you've been reading the Bible wrong. She said you got demons." I almost laughed, and the attempt sent pain shooting through my mouth. Beatrice called everything she didn't control demonic. She was the one who loved darkness, but she wore lace and called it light. Emma glanced at my stitched mouth again, and her small hands clenched into fists. "She said you don't get food till you learn," she said, voice trembling with anger and fear. "But Cook Lizzie gave me that cornbread. She said hide it." I nodded, tore off a tiny piece, softened it in water, and pushed it past my teeth. It tasted like dust and comfort and shame. Emma watched me swallow. Then she leaned in and whispered, "She'd been coming to the door at night." The room chilled, despite the heat in my body. I stared at her. Emma's gaze dropped to the floor. "She just stands there," she whispered, "like she listening, like she waiting for you to make a sound. She smiles." I seen her smile. My stomach turned. That was Beatrice's kind of entertainment. Not the act itself, but the waiting, the anticipation, the power of knowing she could appear whenever she wanted. Emma stepped back quickly when the latch sounded again, and she slipped out through the crack like she'd never been there. I sat alone with crumbs in my palm, and the new knowledge that Beatrice was feeding herself on my silence. Later, when the sun moved across the one small window and painted a rectangle of light on the floor, Dr. Whitfield returned. His coat smelled of camphor and tobacco, and his eyes looked like they hadn't slept. He held a tin of salve and a bottle of whiskey he pretended was medicine. He didn't greet me. He didn't call me by name. He set his bag down and pulled out scissors, small and sharp, and for one bright second my body surged with hope so violent it made me dizzy. But then he used the scissors only to cut the cloth for cleaning. He dabbed at my mouth with alcohol, and I gripped the mattress so hard my nails tore. He whispered, "Hold still," again, always asking me to hold still while the world moved over me like a wagon wheel. I forced my eyes to stay on his face until he finally looked back. His pupils flickered, not with cruelty, but with discomfort at being seen. Good, let him be seen. Let him feel it. When he finished, he cleared his throat and said in a voice too low to be heard outside, "You must not pick at the stitches." I stared at him, then at his hands. His hands were clean, but they were the hands that had done this. He swallowed. "Mistress Harlow insists," he continued, "as if that explained everything, that you be kept quiet." I lifted the slate and wrote, "She insists. You obey." His face tightened. "You don't understand," he murmured, and his whisper was almost angry, like he resented me for forcing him to see himself. "If I refuse her, she will ruin me. She will tell my wife. She will tell the church. She will say I've taken liberties." He said liberties like it was a crime worse than sewing a human mouth shut. I wrote, "And what am I?" He stared at the words. His jaw worked as if chewing on something bitter. "You are," he began, and he couldn't finish. That was the truth caught in his throat. "Property, patient, problem." He set the salve down to hard. "I am trying to keep you alive," he said finally, defensive, as if life without a voice was a gift. I wrote, "WHY?" He looked away toward the door. "Because," he said, and his voice cracked on the word, "because I have to live with myself." Then he did something that almost made me hate him more. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small piece of cloth, folded neatly, and placed it on the table beside the slate. Inside were thin sewing needles and a spool of thread. Not to sew me further at least, I prayed not, but to remind me of what had been done. He saw my eyes go to it, and quickly whispered, "Not for you." And then, after a pause, "For me." I needed to bring it. He wanted a relic of his sin, so he could pretend remorse was penance. Still, a needle was a needle, and Beatrice had taught me the value of tools. When he left, I hid the needles under the mattress and kept the slate in my lap like a shield. That night she came, just as Emma had said, and I did not hear her footsteps at first because Beatrice moved through the house as if the house belonged to her blood. The latch turned softly. The door opened. She didn't enter all the way. She stood in the doorway with a lantern held low, letting the light crawl across the floor toward me like a living thing. Her face was half shadow, half glow, and her eyes looked bright, too bright for a woman who claimed godliness. "No sound," she said softly, as if speaking to a pet. "Good girl." She stepped inside, slow, unhurried, and set the lantern on the table. Then she looked at the slate. "Ah," she murmured, "the doctor gave you a new tongue." She picked it up without asking, read my last words, and smiled. "You're still trying," she said. "Still reaching, still wanting to be heard." She walked closer and sat on the edge of the bed as if it were hers, as if my space was just another chair in her parlor. Her skirt smelled like lavender and starch, clean enough to make me sick. "Let me tell you what you don't understand, Mercy," she whispered, and she said my name. She was tasting something sour. "A slave's suffering is not an accident. It is the order of things. It is what keeps the world from collapsing. If you speak against that order, you are the collapse." She reached out and placed a gloved finger under my chin, lifting my face. I did not pull away. I wanted her to see I was still here. She traced the line of stitches with that gloved finger, pressing just hard enough to make the pain bloom. My eyes watered. She watched it like it was art. "You think you shamed me in my kitchen," she said. "But do you know what you really did? You reminded me that you have an inner life. You reminded me that you believe you are someone." She leaned closer. I could see the fine powder on her skin. "I cannot allow that," she whispered. "Because if you are someone, Then what am I when I do what I do to you? Her breath warmed my cheek. So I will make you nothing again, slowly, day by day, piece by piece. She stood and picked up the plate of food she'd brought, the smell of it hitting my stomach like a blow. You will eat, she said, when you earn it, and earning it will mean learning. She set the plate on the floor this time, close enough that I could reach if I crawled. Then she stepped back and crossed her arms. Go on, she said. Eat like an animal, crawl, use your hands, smear yourself. I want you to look in that little mirror and see what you truly are. She had placed a small mirror against the wall, angled so I could see myself if I moved. The mirror was another mind game, another weapon. I stared at it and saw my own face distorted by swelling, my lips stitched like a butcher's work, blood dried at the corners. I looked monstrous, not because I was, but because she wanted me to feel monstrous. My stomach twisted. She waited, patient, confident. I could have crawled. I could have eaten. My body begged me to, but something in me refused her the satisfaction of seeing me perform my humiliation. I sat still. My hands trembled. My mouth throbbed. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. She stepped forward and kicked the plate lightly, not hard enough to spill, but enough to show she could. Stubborn, she said, and her voice remained calm, which was worse than yelling. Stubborn is what gets you buried. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver bell one she used upstairs to summon servants. She rang it once, a clear bright sound that did not belong in this room. Footsteps approached in the hallway. The door opened wider and two house slaves appeared, heads down, eyes empty. Beatrice smiled at them like a hostess. Hold her, she instructed, as if ordering tea. They moved toward me with slow horror. One was Lizzie, the cook, her jaw clenched, so tight a muscle jumped. The other was Thomas, a young man Beatrice liked to break, because he had once looked proud. They each took an arm. Their hands shook. Beatrice picked up the plate and tore off a piece of meat, then brought it to my stitched lips and pressed it against them. Grease smeared on the thread. My body reacted, mouth trying to open on instinct, but the stitches held. The meat fell to my lap. Beatrice laughed softly. Look at that, she said. Even your own body betrays you. It wants to live. It wants to take what I offer, but it can't, not without my permission. She lifted the bell again. Bring the needle, she told Lizzie. Lizzie's eyes flicked up, startled. Needle, girl, Beatrice repeated, and her sweetness sharpened. From the sewing basket, the thick one, Lizzie hesitated for half a breath, just long enough for Beatrice to notice, and Beatrice's hand shot out and slapped Lizzie across the face, so hard the sound echoed. Do not make me repeat myself, she said, voice still low, still controlled. Lizzie hurried out, and I watched her go with a cold, steady focus. This was Beatrice's true cruelty. She didn't just hurt you, she forced other people to be her hands, so everyone carried the stain. Lizzie returned with a needle and thread. Beatrice took it and held it up to the lantern light. You will eat, she said, but you will eat the way I decide. She turned to Thomas. Open her mouth, she ordered. Thomas's hands shook harder. He looked at me for the first time, his eyes pleading for forgiveness he hadn't earned, but also didn't have the luxury to refuse. He put his fingers at the corners of my mouth and pulled gently. Pain exploded. The stitches stretched, threatening to tear, and blood wet the thread again. A muffled sound escaped my throat, half groan, half cry. Beatrice's eyes lit. There, she said softly. That's the sound of a creature learning its place. She did not sew again that night. She didn't need to. The threat was enough. She leaned in close and whispered, if you try to speak with chalk, I will break your fingers. If you try to speak with your eyes, I will blind you. If you try to speak with your hands, I will take them. Do you understand? I stared at her, and she smiled as if she'd received an answer. Then she placed the food back on the floor and stepped away. Leave her, she instructed the others. Let her decide whether she wants dignity or survival. The door closed. The latch clicked. Silence returned, thick and choking. Lizzie and Thomas were gone, carrying their shame with them, and I was alone with the plate and the mirror and the choice. My stomach cramped so hard I nearly folded. I crawled then not because I wanted to, but because hunger is a whip that strikes from inside, and I had no more strength to pretend I didn't feel it. My knees scraped the wood. I reached for the cornbread and pushed small softened pieces past my teeth, swallowing carefully, each swallow pulling at the stitches like a hook. Tears ran down my face without sound. I hated myself for the crawling, hated Beatrice for making it necessary, hated the world for being built in a way where a woman could do this and still attend church on Sunday with clean gloves. When I finished the scraps, I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and looked at the mirror. I saw what she wanted me to see, a stitched mouth, wet eyes, a woman on her knees. But I also saw something she didn't account for, the way my eyes did not beg, the way they watched, the way they remembered. The next day she began the routine, and routines were her favorite because they turned suffering into a calendar. In the morning a servant brought water, but only half a cup. In the afternoon Beatrice sent Margaret down with a basket of sewing to do in the corner, not to help, but to watch, to learn. Margaret sat there humming softly while I lay on the bed, fevered again, and every now and then she looked up at me with curiosity, a girl studying an insect pin to cork. "Mother says you were impertinent," she said one afternoon, voice bright. "Mother says your kind forgets you're meant to be quiet." I stared at her. She tilted her head. "Does it hurt?" she asked, and there was no pity in it, only interest. I didn't answer because I couldn't. She smiled. "I think it's clever," she said. "Mother always knows what to do." Then she went back to her stitches, practicing obedience on cloth, while my mouth rotted shut. Beatrice came down at night to inspect me, sometimes alone, sometimes with her son James trailing behind like a shadow. James would stand at the door, hands in his pockets, watching, and I could see the boy fighting to urge his revulsion and fascination. Beatrice wanted him to have fascination. She wanted her children trained, too. "Look," she would say, pointing at my mouth, as if showing him a new horse. "This is what happens when they think they're equal." James would nod. Sometimes he would swallow hard. Sometimes he would laugh, because laughter was safer than empathy in that house. And always Beatrice watched their faces as much as she watched mine, measuring what her lessons were planting. Days blurred. Infection flared and calmed. My breath stank with rot. My lips cracked at the corners and bled. I slept in shallow bursts and woke to the taste of iron. The slate became my only weapon, but even that Beatrice tried to poison by turning it into a stage for humiliation. One afternoon, she entered with Dr. Whitfield behind her and placed the slate on my lap. "Write," she instructed. Whitfield hovered, tense, eyes darting. "Write an apology," she said. "Write that you were wrong. Write that you were grateful for my discipline." My hands trembled. If I refused, she would punish me and punish others. If I obeyed, she would have my humiliation in my own hand. Whitfield's throat bobbed. He looked like a man waiting to see which way his soul would fall. I lifted the chalk. Beatrice smiled, satisfied already. And then I wrote 3 words, slow and deliberate, each one a nail. I remember everything. Beatrice's smile vanished. The room went still. Whitfield sucked in a breath. Beatrice stared at the slate as if it had spit in her face. "You insolent," she began, and her calm finally cracked, just enough to show the rage beneath. She raised her hand as if to slap me, but she stopped midair, her eyes narrowing, something calculating returning. She lowered her hand and smiled again, colder than before. "Oh," she said softly, "you think remembering is power." She leaned close until her face filled my vision. "Then I will give you more to remember." She turned to Whitfield. "Doctor," she said, "sweet as honey, you will bring laudanum tonight. Enough to keep her awake, but too weak to move." Whitfield's face drained. "Mistress, that dosage tonight," Beatrice repeated, and the word was a command wrapped in silk. Whitfield nodded, because he was a coward dressed as a professional. Beatrice straightened, picked up the slate, and with one smooth motion snapped it in half across her knee. The crack loud in the small room. She dropped the pieces on the floor. "No more writing," she said. "No more cleverness. Tonight you will learn what it means to have a body that betrays you, She walked out, her skirts whispering like secrets, and Whitfield lingered a moment, staring at the broken slate, staring at me. His lips parted as if to say something. He didn't. He left. The latch clicked, and I sat alone with the chalk dust on my fingers, my mouth stitched shut, and the sudden knowledge that whatever Beatrice had planned for the night would not be quick, would not be simple, and would be designed not to kill me, but to make me wish she had. The laudanum came with the dark, the way a storm comes with clouds. You pretend not to see until the first drop hits your skin. I knew it was night because the house shifted into its quieter lies, the kind that pretends sleep is peace. My door opened without ceremony and Dr. Whitfield entered carrying a small vial between his fingers like it weighed more than it did, like it might pull him down if he held it too long. His face was grey and pinched, and for the first time since the needle went through my mouth, he did not look at Beatrice when he spoke because she was not there to speak for him. "I'm going to give you something," he said, voice barely above breath, as if the walls had ears that would carry his words upstairs for judgment. He set the vial on the table and hesitated, then took a chair and sat, elbows on knees, staring at the floor like a man waiting for a sentence. "She ordered it," he added, because he always needed that sentence to exist, needed the blame to have a name that was not his own. I watched him, my heart steady in a way that surprised me. Fear had burned itself out days ago and left something harder behind. He uncorked the vial and poured a careful measure into a spoon, then held it to my lips. The smell was sweet and medicinal, cloying, promising sleep it had no intention of giving. I opened my mouth, as much as the stitches would allow unswallowed. The liquid slid down my throat like syrup and settled heavy in my chest. He waited, counting silently, watching my eyes as if they were gauges on a machine. "It will make you weak," he murmured. "It will not." He stopped, swallowed, then said the truth. "It will not be kind." My limbs grew heavy within minutes, as if the mattress had become mud and was pulling me under. The room tilted, the edges blurred, but my mind stayed sharp, sharp as a blade honed on rage. That was Beatrice's mistake. She believed suffering dulled thought. She had never suffered enough to know better. When the drug took hold, Whitfield stood and paced, hands rubbing together, breath coming to fast. "I can't stay," he said. "She will come. She will watch." I nodded once, slow, letting him see I understood. He hovered at the door, then turned back, as if something were clawing at his chest. "I didn't know," he whispered, and I almost laughed again at how small men make themselves to survive. Then he was gone, and the door closed, and the night began its work. Beatrice arrived an hour later, lantern in hand, smile prepared. She took in the sight of me eyes open, body slack, mouth stitched, and satisfaction settled on her like a shawl. "There," she said softly, "still awake. Good." She set the lantern down and walked a slow circle around the bed, the hem of her skirt whispering against the floor. "This is what obedience feels like," she murmured. "Your body says no, but you do not get to listen." She reached out and pressed a finger into the swollen flesh at the corner of my mouth. I couldn't pull away. Pain flared, bright and precise. She watched my pupils dilate. "I could end you," she said conversationally. "I could tell the doctor to stop tending you and let the rot finish its work. But then what lesson would that teach? Death is too final. It does not educate." She leaned close, her breath warm and scented. "I want you to live long enough to forget who you were." She straightened and turned toward the door, then paused. "Oh," she added, almost as an afterthought, "if you survive this, you will thank me. They always do. Gratitude is what comes after you learn your place." She left me there with the laudanum humming in my veins, my body a traitor and my mind a witness. Time stretched. Pain ebbed and surged like a tide. I drifted in and out of half-sleep, waking each time my mouth pulsed with heat. Each time my throat worked around the stitches. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed. I counted the strikes to keep myself anchored. When dawn finally thinned the darkness, I was still alive. That seemed to disappoint her. The days that followed were a lesson in endurance she designed carefully, like embroidery. The laudanum came nightly, never enough to put me under, always enough to keep me helpless. Beatrice varied the hours, so I could not prepare. She varied the food, so hunger never became predictable. She brought visitors, sometimes her sister from Savannah, a neighbor with pale eyes, and a laugh like glass, and she showed me, as if I were proof of something. She was unruly, Beatrice would explain, gesturing to my mouth. One must be firm. The women would cluck their tongues and murmur approval or look away, but none would object. Silence is contagious among those who benefit from it. Dr. Whitfield came daily, his face wearing grooves where guilt had begun to carve it. He cleaned the wound and shook his head, murmuring about infection, about risk, about time, as if time were a neutral thing. I watched him closely, cataloguing the moments when his hands hesitated, when his breath stuttered, when his eyes lingered on my face, not with curiosity, but with something like recognition. Recognition is dangerous. It makes men question their reflections. One afternoon, when Beatrice was upstairs and the house hummed with quiet, he leaned closer than he needed to and whispered, "If I loosen them, just a little, it might help you heal." I stared at him, then slowly shook my head. He frowned. "Why?" I lifted the broken slate pieces from under the mattress and pressed them into his palm, then took the chalk stub and wrote on the tabletop with clumsy fingers, "Not yet." He stared at the words, confusion knitting his brow. I wrote again, slower. "She watches. Heals means her credit." He swallowed. "You're thinking," he whispered, half accusation, half awe. I wrote. I never stopped. That was when something in him shifted. Not all at once. Whitfield was not brave. He was a man who moved an inch at a time away from the cliff. But inches add up. He began to talk to me then, in whispers, in fragments, as if confessing could lighten him. He told me about his wife, about the church, about the sermons that spoke of mercy without mentioning people like me. He told me about the first time he had stitched the slaves back without reporting it. The first compromise that taught him how to survive in Beatrice's world. I told myself I was helping, he said, eyes wet, that it was better than refusing. I wrote, "Better for who?" He closed his eyes. The infection worsened in my mouth, the tissue swollen and angry, and Whitfield increased his visits, bringing bitter tonics and clean cloths he paid for himself. He lingered longer each time, and in the lingering he began to see Beatrice more clearly, not as his patron, but as a disease that spread wherever she touched. One evening, after Beatrice had left with her children for a prayer meeting, Whitfield sat on the edge of my bed and spoke without whispering, his voice low but steady. "She enjoys it," he said. "I've seen it in her eyes. I tell myself I am a doctor, but I am her instrument." I wrote, "Instruments can change hands." He looked at me then with something like fear. "What are you saying?" he asked. I wrote, "I will not die quiet." He rubbed his face with both hands. "If you try anything," he said, "she will kill you. Or worse." I wrote, "Worse is already here." The words hung between us like smoke. He sat there a long time, breathing, thinking, listening to the house. When he finally spoke, it was barely audible. "If I remove them," he said, not meeting my eyes, "if I cut the stitches, she will know." I wrote, "Not if you choose the night." He shook his head. "She takes laudanum," he said automatically, the way facts fall out when men are afraid. "Every night. A heavy dose. She doesn't sleep without it." My heart beat once, hard. I wrote, "How heavy?" He looked up sharply. "No," he said. "No." I held his gaze and wrote, "You know the measure. You always have." His breath quickened. "You want me to help you," he whispered. I wrote, "Help me live." He laughed then, a short broken sound. "That's not what you mean," he said. I wrote, "Help me end IT." The room seemed to contract. He stood abruptly and paced. "I could be hanged," he said. "I could lose everything." I wrote, "You lost IT when you took the needle." He stopped and looked at me as if I'd struck him. "What would you do?" he asked hoarsely. I took the chalk and wrote a single word, pressing hard enough to snap it again. "Justice." He read it and closed his eyes. "There is no justice here," he said. I wrote, "Then we make IT." Days passed. The routine continued. Beatrice grew bored in the way predators do when prey stops begging. She began to speak of removing the stitches when the lesson had settled, of parading my obedience as proof of her benevolence. She liked to plan my future aloud, to tell me how grateful I would be. I let her. I needed her confidence. Whitfield returned one night later than usual, his coat damp with sweat. He did not sit. He did not pace. He stood at the foot of my bed and said, "Tomorrow." My pulse jumped. He held up a hand. After midnight, he continued, "She takes her dose at 10. I will bring more. Enough to keep her asleep." He swallowed hard. "I will remove the stitches. Quickly. They will be bleeding." I nodded. He hesitated, then said, "And then?" I wrote carefully, my hands steady. "I will not speak. I will act." His face strained. "You mean?" I wrote. "I mean what she taught me." His shoulders sagged. "If I help you," he said. "I am damned." I wrote. "Damnation is a choice." He let out a long breath. "I will bring what you need," he said, and his voice shook like a bridge under weight. "A needle, thread, the same," I wrote. "And laudanum," he nodded. "Enough," he said. We sat in silence then, not comfortable, but resolved. When he left, the night pressed in, and for the first time since the basement, I felt something like calm. Not peace. Calm is different. Calm is the absence of doubt. The next day Beatrice visited, with a bouquet of lies. She spoke of church and charity and discipline. She told me she was proud of my progress. She told me obedience was a gift she gave me. I watched her mouth move, watched the soft lips form words that had cost me mine. That night, when the house slept and the clock marked time like a metronome, the door opened and Whitfield slipped in, his bag heavy. He worked quickly, hands sure now, guilt replaced by purpose. "This will hurt," he whispered. He cut the first stitch and blood spilled hot and bright, and pain lanced through me so sharp it cleared the fog entirely. He cut again, and again, each snip a release and a wound. I gripped the mattress and focused on breathing through my nose, on not making a sound that would betray us. When the last stitch came free, my lips parted slowly, stiff and burning, and a whole sound escaped me, more breath than word. Whitfield pressed a cloth to my mouth. "Don't speak," he said urgently. I nodded. He handed me the needle and thread, and the vial of laudanum. The tools weighed almost nothing and everything at once. "She will not wake," he whispered. "I've measured it." I met his eyes and saw fear and resolve tangled together. I nodded once more. He opened the door and listened, then motioned me forward. As I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet silent on the floor I had scrubbed 4 years, I understood the last lesson Beatrice had given me without intending to. When you teach someone exactly how to break, you also teach them exactly where the seams are. The hallway breathed with me as I moved, each step a negotiation between pain and purpose, my mouth a raw, burning wound that reminded me with every swallow that nothing done here would ever be clean again. Whitfield faded back into the shadows behind me, already rehearsing the version of himself he would present to the morning, and I did not look back, because looking back is how resolve loosens. Beatrice's door stood at the end of the corridor, closed, ordinary, no different from any other door she owned. And that was the lie of the house. It taught you that cruelty hid behind familiar things. I paused there, hand on the knob, and listened. Inside, the room was quiet in the deep way of drug sleep, the kind that steals even dreams. I opened the door and stepped into her world, the air heavy with lavender and starch and the faint sweetness of laudanum. The lantern on her bedside table burned low. Her curtains were drawn. Beatrice lay on her back, hair spread neatly on the pillow, mouth parted slightly, breath slow and regular. She looked smaller asleep, almost harmless, and I understood then how many people had mistaken that stillness for innocence. I crossed the room without sound and set the vial on the table, then the needle and thread beside it, arranging them carefully because order steadied my hands. My lips throbbed, and when I pressed the cloth Whitfield had given me to them, it came away wet and red. I did not wipe the blood from my chin. I wanted to remember how it felt to carry my pain into her space. I stood there a moment longer, not to pray, not to hesitate, but to let the weight of the choice settle fully into my bones. This was not rage. Rage burns out. This was something colder and heavier, something that did not need shouting. I reached for her wrist and felt for the pulse, strong and sure, and for an instant I thought of how easily she had felt for mine when deciding how long to starve me, how much to hurt me, how far to go without killing. The symmetry pleased me and disgusted me in equal measure. I uncaught the vial and tipped a careful measure between her lips, supporting her jaw, so the liquid slid down without choking. She swallowed reflexively and sighed. Sinking deeper, I waited. When her breathing deepened further, when her body slackened into that heavy surrender she trusted every night, I took the needle. The thread was already cut, already threaded. Whitfield's hands having prepared it as if for a lesson he could not finish. I climbed onto the bed and straddled her hips, my knees sinking into the mattress that had held her dreaming while she planned my destruction. Her skin was warm beneath my palms. I pressed my hand over her mouth and nose to test her reaction. There was none. I removed my hand and began. The first puncture broke the skin at the corner of her mouth, and a small sound escaped her throat. Not a scream, not even a cry, just a startled breath that fluttered against my fingers. Her eyes snapped open then, wide and unfocused, pupils swimming. She tried to speak, to demand, to command, and found that sound had deserted her. The needle went in again, higher, and she convulsed beneath me, hands flying up to claw at my arms, nails scraping skin. I leaned my weight forward and pinned her wrists with my forearms, just as the men had pinned me to the table in the basement. She fought then, strength surging in a panic the drug could not entirely smother, and for a moment I had to grit my teeth and hold on, feeling her power strain against mine. I did not rush. I remembered her words about patience, about education, and I applied them carefully. Stitch by stitch, I drew her mouth closed, the thread biting into flesh, the skin giving reluctantly, blood seeping bright and hot. Her eyes locked on mine, and in them I saw not repentance, not understanding, but fury and disbelief that the world had inverted itself without her permission. She shook her head violently, trying to dislodge me, and I leaned closer so she could see my face clearly, the swollen lips, the scars the stitches had left, the blood at my chin. I did not speak. I did not need to. She knew me then. Recognition flickered and died, replaced by terror. When the final stitch was tied, when her mouth was sealed in the same rough, unmerciful way mine had been, I sat back on my heels and watched her. Her breath came in ragged bursts through her nose, nostrils flaring, chest heaving. She tried to scream again and again, and each attempt ended in a wet, useless sound that sprayed blood into the thread. Panic broke through the laudanum then, and her body thrashed, knocking the lantern so it rattled on the table. I reached for the cloth and pressed it hard against her mouth, not to be kind, but to keep her from choking on what she could not expel. She writhed beneath me, eyes rolling, tears spilling, and I thought of Emma on the kitchen floor, nose bleeding, eyes wide with fear. I thought of Lizzie's hand shaking as she held the needle. I thought of Whitfield's whispered apologies that had done nothing to loosen the thread. I did not think of forgiveness. I did not think of God. I thought of silence, and how she had loved it when it belonged to others. I leaned down until my face was inches from hers and whispered, my voice a rasp that tore at my throat. "This is what you wanted." The sound startled her more than any blow could have. She shook her head frantically, eyes pleading now, and I felt a brief, sharp twist in my chest that might have been pity if I had allowed it to grow. I did not. Pity would have been a luxury she never afforded me. I picked up the pillow and held it over her face, pressing down as she bucked beneath me, her legs kicking, heels drumming against the mattress. Her hands clawed at my arms, at my face, fingers catching in my hair, and for a second, she was strong enough to shift me, to make the balance precarious. I adjusted, planted my weight, and pressed harder. Her movements slowed, then stuttered, then surged once more in a desperate, animal rhythm. I counted my breaths to keep myself steady. When the fighting stopped, when her chest no longer rose, I held the pillow there a moment longer than necessary, because Beatrice had taught me that certainty mattered. Then I lifted it and watched her. Her eyes stared at nothing, wide and glassy. The thread darkened with blood. Her face, so carefully controlled in life, had collapsed into something slack and small. I felt nothing like triumph. I felt a hollow ache, as if something essential had been scooped out of me and left behind. I slid off the bed and stood there, swaying, my legs weak, my mouth burning with every breath. There was work to do. Whitfield had been precise in his instructions, and I followed them as I had followed Beatrice's rules for years, with attention and care. I wiped the needle clean and placed it back where it had been, arranging the thread to look if it had been used by her own hand. I tipped the vial so a little laudanum spilled onto the sheets, staining them. I loosened her grip on the pillow and positioned it as if she had pulled it to her face herself. I smeared a little blood onto her hands, under her nails, evidence for those who needed it. The house would want a story that made sense to it, and this one would. When I finished, I stood back and looked at the scene, at the woman who had made a craft of cruelty lying still and unremarkable, and I understood that nothing I had done would undo what she had done to me. That was the lie of revenge, and it was a lie I accepted fully. I wiped my hands on my skirt and moved to the door. The hallway was empty, the house holding its breath. I padded back to my room and retrieved the small bundle Whitfield had prepared: bread, cloth, a knife I did not want, but would not refuse. At the back stairs, he waited, pale and shaking, eyes darting. When he saw my face, my mouth raw and free, he flinched. "Is it he began. I nodded once. He swallowed and stepped aside, opening the door that led to the night. Cool air rushed in, sharp and clean, and for a second it stole my breath. "Go," he whispered. "Don't come back." I did not thank him. Gratitude would have been a lie, and lies had already filled that house. I slipped into the darkness and ran, my feet finding paths I had memorized during years of labor, my body carrying me forward on instinct. Behind me, the house stood silent, its windows dark. By the time the first scream came, tearing the morning open, I was already gone, my heart pounding, my mouth bleeding, my mind replaying her eyes as they had looked at the end. Not punished, not enlightened, just surprised. I ran until the dark thinned into a grey that felt like mercy only because it was different, my lungs burning, my mouth a constant pulse of pain that reminded me the body keeps score long after the mind pretends it doesn't. The land beyond Harlow opened into fields I had worked and woods I had memorized in pieces, and I moved through them the way you move through a dream you've practiced for years, turning when instinct told me to, ducking when branches reached like hands, listening for dogs that never came. Dawn crept in without ceremony, staining the sky a dull color that made everything look honest and ugly. I crossed a shallow creek and let the cold water wash blood from my chin, cupping it to my mouth, tasting iron and mud, and something like freedom that had no sweetness to it yet. When I reached the first marker, Whitfield had described a leaning oak split by lightning long before was born. I stopped and pressed my back to the bark, sliding down until I sat in the leaves and shook, the aftershock finally claiming its due. I did not cry. Tears would have been noise. I breathed and waited, counting heartbeats, listening to the world prove it would continue without Beatrice Harlow at its center. The Underground Railroad did not feel like rails or stations or anything solid. It felt like a series of doors that might open if you knocked the right way and might swallow you if you didn't. The first door opened at a farmhouse with a low roof and a woman who did not ask my name. She saw my mouth, my bloodied skirt, and the way my hands shook, and she stepped aside without a word. She fed me broth through a spoon, slow and careful, and when I tried to speak and the sound came out wrong, she shook her head gently and touched my arm, as if to say words were not required here. She burned my dress and gave me another, plain and coarse, and hid me in a root cellar that smelled of earth and onions and safety that could be revoked at any moment. Men came at night with wagons and eyes that slid past mine, live out of cruelty, but out of habit, because the fewer details you carried, the lighter your conscience travelled. We moved in pieces, never the same route twice, sleeping in barns and back rooms and sometimes in the open under a sky that felt too wide to trust. At each stop, someone looked at my mouth and flinched, and I learned to lower my gaze, not because I was ashamed, but because I was tired of being an exhibit. I learned to drink without spilling, to eat without tearing the wounds anew, to sleep in bursts that ended with my heart racing at imagined footsteps. When I finally crossed into Philadelphia, the city did not greet me with fanfare or forgiveness. It smelled of coal and sweat and possibility. It smelled like a place where people were busy enough not to notice you unless you asked to be noticed. A man at the last safe house wrote my name on a scrap of paper and handed it to me, as if returning something that had been misplaced. "You're free here," he said. And I understood immediately how incomplete that sentence was. Freedom is not a switch you flip. It is a condition you learn to tolerate. I found work sewing, my fingers remembering what my mouth had been denied. Needle and thread moving through cloth with a familiarity that made my stomach twist. Each puncture was a small echo, each knot a reminder that hands can build or bind depending on who commands them. I kept my head down. I did not tell my story. Stories travel faster than people, and I had learned the cost of being known. At night, in the narrow room I rented, I practiced speaking to the wall, to the air, to the memory of myself. The words came slowly, rasped and broken, my voice a stranger that did not know its own strength. Some nights I could not speak at all, and the silence returned like an old captor, patient and familiar. News reached me the way rumors do, bent and smudged by distance. Mistress Beatrice Harlow had been found dead in her bed. The papers said, a tragic case of a distraught woman who had taken too much laudanum and smothered herself in her sleep. There was sympathy. There were kind words about her charity and discipline. There was no mention of a slave named Mercy. No mention of stitches. No mention of a kitchen floor stained with a child's blood. The house mourned properly. The church filled. Master Richard accepted condolences with red eyes and a clean conscience. The children were pitied. The world swallowed the lie whole because it was easier to digest than the truth. I folded the paper and burned it, watching the ink curl and blacken, and felt something tighten in my chest that was not relief. I had not wanted applause. I had not wanted justice to arrive with trumpets. But the ease with which the story closed around her like a blanket left me cold. The system did not even cough. It did not notice the removal of one cruel woman because it was designed to function without her, to replace her if necessary, to keep the shape of power intact. I understood then that my act had been a wound, not a cure. Freedom did not erase the past. It sharpened it. In Philadelphia, I met others like me, women and men who carried marks they did not display unless asked, and sometimes not even then. We spoke in fragments. We shared bread and names and routes and warnings. I helped when I could, hiding runaways in my room for a night, passing messages, stitching coats with pockets sewn just so. When Emma's face came to me in dreams, I woke with my hands clenched, and the dreams did not ask whether I was right. They only replayed what had been. There were days when I felt strong, when I walked the streets and breathed the air and let the city swallow me like a river. And there were days when a woman's perfume or the ring of a bell sent me back into the basement, my mouth burning, my body braced for commands that did not come. I learned to live alongside that fracture. I learned that survival is not a clean line, but a collection of compromises you make with yourself. I did not become a symbol. Not here. Symbols are for people who have the luxury of distance. I became a seamstress who flinched at certain sounds and spoke carefully, and watched faces the way some people watch weather. When my mouth finally healed into scars, when my voice found a shape that belonged to me again, I spoke less than I could have. Silence, once imposed, can become a habit you have to unlearn daily. I did not marry. I did not return south. I kept moving when stillness felt like a trap. Years later, when I stood at a graveside not my own and listened to prayers that spoke of mercy as if it were a simple thing, I understood the last truth Beatrice had taught me without intending to. Cruelty leaves a residue that does not wash off with time or distance. The price of my freedom was not just blood. It was the knowledge that what I had done would never sit neatly inside a story with a beginning and an end. There would be no moment when I could say it was over. There would only be days I chose to live anyway. When I think back to that hallway and the door at its end, to the weight of the needle in my hand and the way her eyes searched mine for an answer I did not give, I do not feel satisfaction. I feel the ache of a lesson learned too well. Silence can be a weapon, so can memory. I carry both, and if there is a justice in that, it is a quiet one, unfinished, the kind that does not comfort, only reminds you that some doors open outward and never close behind you.